Welcome to The Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 29 of Gods and Gateways. The gods returned from their after battle rest, gathering in the great hall as Staravan drew a window to the mortal world. Together they watched as the fishermen helped Raoma and the women debark. Grunwald leapt lightly from the boat's rail to the bank, after his companions. The captain followed, taking them the few steps into the trees they needed in order to catch sight of the road. He pointed them in the direction of the crossroads, and Roma bowed his head in thanks. The gods watched as Roma picked up a scattering of stones and cast the spell for soothing the river, and saw Pater's look of relief when he explained how to use them to still the waters where the two rivers met. As the stone passed between them, the two men clasped hands and parted. The priest turned to his companions, and the fisher captain returned to his boat. The gods didn't stay to see a vessel freed from its temporary mooring and set on a course downstream. Instead, they shifted the focus of their scry to another section of the forest. There, a lone figure walked silently through the trees. He wore a tunic and breeches of cloth in mottled greens and browns, and a cloak of the same blotchy material, its hood thrown back to expose tawny hair streaked with grey. He was looking for something, seeking herbs hiding in the undergrowth for his latest magical concoction. As the gods watched, the man stooped and peered more closely at a delicate orchid holding a soft pink flower toward the rising sun. Smiling softly, the man whispered a prayer of thanks to the gods of nature. After a longer inspection, the man took a muslin bag from the pouch at his belt and unhooked the small trowel that hung beside it, then carefully dug the orchid from its hiding place and tucked it into the bag. With a smile bordering on satisfaction, he straightened and continued his search. Look, Miralay whispered, nudging her husband in the ribs. He still grieves the loss of Sophriel. Staravan studied the man's face more closely and saw the redness that rimmed his eyes. Extending his senses toward the searching figure, he felt the man's sadness like a blow and quickly withdrew his touch. Nodding to his wife, he sighed. It is well that he does, he answered. It means he will care for her children all the better. Miralay settled at his side, her hand seeking his own. Her touch drew a soft smile from the Lord of Gods, and he accepted it. Together they watched the man continue his search, occasionally shifting the focus of the scry to where Raoma led his companions away from the river. The two were to meet shortly thereafter. Unaware of the deity's interest, Raoma continued toward the road. He'd caught a glimpse of it in the distance, but a dip in the land had made it further away than it looked. Cutting toward it, he led his companions through the trees, wishing he was more familiar with the forests, or that Falcon was still with them. Ahead of him, he heard the soft rustle of footsteps through the grass. The others heard them as well, with Brianda and Ghost sliding into the bushes. Grunwald drew close beside him, sliding his sword from its scabbard in a whisper of metal against leather. This time his axe stayed in its hanger. The footsteps stopped, and Raoma felt their maker extend his senses in their direction. Alessia gasped, and Sindra hissed in surprise, making him wish he'd been allowed to keep the blade he'd carried as a servant of Enshul. That one had belonged to the goddess, and she hadn't let him keep it. Who goes there? He called, knowing that whatever or whoever lay ahead had sensed at least one of them. He signaled for Alessia and Sindra to move into hiding and winced at the sound they made as they obeyed. Someone you don't know, came the reply, and Raoma tensed. Whoever stood ahead, their voice carried power. Why don't you show yourself? He asked. Why don't you? This time the answer came from another direction. Raoma almost pivoted toward it when an idea crossed his mind and he turned away from it instead. The turn brought him in line with the gap between two tall, rough-barked oaks. Something moved across it, and he frowned, tracing the movement with his eyes. Grunwald echoed his expression, his blade curving before him. You don't look very friendly. This time the voice commented from behind them and was answered by another. That's because we can't afford to be. Brander's response came from directly in front of them. Rayamar looked but didn't see her, and his eyebrows raised. Something shifted in the foreground of the two oaks, and he drew a little of Staravan's power. Carefully he shaped it, sub-vocalizing the command to release it. The power leapt away from him, shifting toward the gap in the trees. He sensed rather than saw its progress, watching it wrap itself around the presence it found just beyond their trunks. Something shimmered at its touch, and this time Roma saw a man dressed in green and brown motley, with a series of plants rooted in the muslin bags at his belt. He regarded the Kavarag with a bemused look. "You seem to have me at a disadvantage," he said quietly. "We mean no harm," Roma told him, ignoring his pointed look at Grumwell and his extended blade. "We're travellers searching for the crossroads, and I am Roma." "And I am Bloodbriar." This time Brianda's response came from behind the man. He didn't flinch or turn to see her. "My name is Malachite," he replied, not taking his eyes from Roma's face. "After the stone. I live in these forests." He made a small gesture with his hand, and Roma saw something move, a creeper wrapped around the branch of one of the trees behind him. It acted too quickly for him to warn Brianda. Another gesture, and another creeper lashed out, this time to meet Grunwald as he charged forward with a roar. Roma stared as Brianda was lifted from behind the mage, her dagger falling to the leaf litter below. It hit the forest floor at the same time as Grunwald's sword was snatched from the barbarian's hand. "Grunwald, no!" Roma cried, but the barbarian was already committed to his path. The mottled wizard grimaced and snapped his fingers, making a jerking motion with his wrist. Another creeper snapped down. This one wrapped itself around the charging barbarian and hoisted him into a tree. When all movement ceased, the wizard looked back at Rheomar. "Anyone else?" he asked. "He means us no harm." Syndra's words whispered through his mind, and Rheomar startled. His faint jerk brought a wariness to the wizard before him, and he shook his head. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Of course I'm sure," Syndra retorted, her mind voice full of affront. Rheomar smiled, and the wizard tensed, raising the finger on his left hand. Rheomar lifted his own hand in placation. "Please," he said, "she tells us you mean us no harm." The wizard lowered his finger, but raised his eyebrows. "Indeed," he replied. "Would that be the one who had a dagger to my ribs, the one who charged me, or one of the two I've got wrapped up in the bushes?" "Yes," Rheomar answered. "Ah, that would be the one with the mind touch, then," the wizard said. "She I left conscious. The other has a frightening aptitude for magic untamed." Rheomar nodded, noting a patch of dark mist drift from behind the trees to the wizard's left. He frowned. Something about that patch of mist was familiar. The wizard saw his frown and turned. "By the goddess!" he exclaimed when he saw it. "The god of balance said nothing of your stubbornness when he bade me greet you." He murmured a hasty phrase that made golden lightning dance across the palms of his hands, and before the mist could become anything else, he clapped his hands in front of it. There was a whimper of pain, and Ghost materialized, unconscious, on the forest floor. "My apologies," he said, and Rheomar sighed. Seeing his companions were safe, if somewhat immobilized, he turned to a more pressing matter. "You were sent by my lord Staravan?" he asked. The wizard nodded. "To meet one Rheomar Philomath, Grunwald his guardian, one wizardess, Alessia Misselmorn, and her apprentice Syndra, one Brianda Bloodbriar, and one—" He turned and glanced down. "Ghost. Yes, that seems to be all of you." Hearing the man speak with such surety, Rheomar closed his eyes, sending a request for confirmation to the heavens. The reply came with a sense of calm sureness that settled in his spirit and eased his doubts. "He speaks the truth," he confirmed, loudly enough for his answer to reach his friends, but not for it to travel too much further into the forest. Above him, Grunwald's struggles ceased. "Then tell him to let us down," the barbarian growled, and was supported by sounds of agreement from Brianda, who also hung, suspended from a branch. Malachite sighed. "Very well." This time the gesture he made was gentle. His palm glided downward and smoothed flat. The vines holding Grunwald and Brianda echoed the signal, lowering them gently to the ground rather than dropping them in swift release. His next gesture had very little relation to the action. Malachite clicked his fingers, and the vines unwound themselves and returned to their inanimate state in the trees. You'd best tend to the little one, Malachite told Rama. She'll have a headache when she wakes. The young elf stirred as he spoke, and Rama hurried to her side. It took only a little of Staravan's power to soothe the pain away, but Ghost woke angry, looking past him at the wizard, her eyes full of fire. Be at ease, apprentice, Rama soothed. He's a friend. Didn't seem like a friend, Ghost grumbled. He was sent by Staravan, Rama explained, using his tone to indicate they shouldn't harm the man. He could have told us, Alessia snapped. I couldn't see you all, the wizard replied. He watched Grunwald sheath his sword. Also, I was looking for a group. Among other things, Sindra said, pointing at the plants on his belt. The mage blushed, but whether that was from annoyance or embarrassment was hard to tell. Why waste a trip? He countered, then shrugged. Anyway, it matters not. I found you now. He paused, looking awkward, then drew a deep breath and continued when they didn't interrupt. Sturavan has asked me to shorten your travel, he said, cocking his head as though still listening to instructions. He said time does not allow for a prolonged journey by road and the many dangers that would accompany it. Rama felt the same press of urgency and nodded. Then we'll follow you, he said, for time is running out and faster than we knew. In the Hall of the Gods, Staravan gave a hefty sigh and leaned back in his seat on the dais. They found each other, he said, waiting for the gathered deities to lift their eyes from the scene in the forest below them. Now what? Enshul demanded. The other gods murmured in agreement, and Staravan rose from his seat. Now, he told them, we must gather our servants in Corinth and prepare them for the coming confrontation. You must decide whom you will send. We will need holy warriors, masters of the three magics, and our priests. And you will need us. The voice was old, perhaps older than the mountains of the world below. It contained the echo of continents colliding, mountains falling, and the perpetual crash and grind of the world's bones. Staravan turned toward it, feeling magic rise around him as the gathered gods prepared to defend themselves. Elemental it was, forming from, no, through, the very wall of the gods' great hall. None of the gathered deities spoke as it entered, sliding from the marbled stonework of the wall behind Staravan and coming to a serpentine halt beside him. Its dark eyes shone with quiet satisfaction, marred by concern as it focused on the leader of the gods. My companions wait outside for your invitation. They have more manners than I. And not the means to pass through stone, Staravan thought wryly as he raised his voice to ask his unexpected guests inside.